Hi, I'm Mark Moses, and this is the MuniFinanceGuy podcast. Today, I'm going to talk about the stealth crisis. While national debt makes the headlines, the mounting obligations of our cities are creating a parallel disaster that's no one is courageous enough to admit or confront. And I've captured my analysis in a new essay for the publication Broken, titled America's Next Reckoning: Municipal Debt and the Failure of Local Reform. So in this episode, we're going to follow the basic content of that article, look past the distinguished budget awards to find out what's really happening in our cities and how we can fix it. So, as I mentioned, we hear a lot about the national debt crossing 100% of GDP, and there's accounting for the national debt that just goes up by the second. But that's really only half the story of what's going on in our nation. The Main Street reckoning is somewhat hidden because, first of all, it's dispersed through all the cities throughout the country. It's confused because cities can't even account for all of their obligations. For example, cities do not traditionally tally up their deferred maintenance and compute how much it would cost to bring all their maintenance current. So we hear about the pension obligations and the bond issuances, but there's deferred maintenance that I think in some cases, in some cities, exceed those other obligations. And then there's just the general confusion around municipal budgets. And I lived this for 3 decades where no one could really conceptualize how is the city really doing financially and what the standard should be. Should the standard just be, oh, we can pay our bills for the next 3 months and then that's okay? Or should we have enough in the way of resources to cover all obligations, all debt, and have that money on hand? Or is it somewhere in between, some kind of balance of what's on hand, what the obligations are, and what the strategies are for extinguishing the debt? And so there's just a lot of confusion around where cities even stand in terms of their financial status. And yet, the Government Finance Officers Association routinely awards cities the Distinguished Budget Presentation Award. There's nothing about that award that relates to how the city is managing its finances. It's simply a process award. If you follow the best practices type process, it doesn't matter what's going on with your city, you still receive this award. The award system just further support a structure where it's form over substance. And we'll see how that plays out here. So with all this confusion, what is offered as a solution? There have been 3 basic approaches to solutions. There was an early solution and made popular in the 90s, the reinventing government kind of trend. This comes back in various forms from time to time, but it's basically about making what the organizations do, making what our municipalities do more efficient. And where that has failed is it simply addresses means and not ends, and assumes that the goals of the organization are appropriate. And so later, we have a new kind of paradigm called the price of government, where government is considered just another kind of service provider that has pricing that can create competition between its own employees and private sector, that it deals with issues of demand for its services. And what distinguishes that approach is there's no real attempt to solve the financial crisis in local government. The crisis is basically embraced, and we're supposed to resign ourselves to perpetual ongoing fiscal crisis. And so then the only real issue is when taxes are too high, the voters push back, and then the services will deteriorate, and then the voters will push back again, only to push taxes higher. And so there's this hopeless oscillation between taxpayers paying exorbitant taxes and unacceptable service levels. And that's generally, I would say, the dominant kind of way people conceptualize the situation. They've given up on trying to solve the problem. It's just a matter of how much will the taxpayers support, and how can we tweak service levels to accommodate our resources. But there's a newer kind of approach that's brewing, that's already been endorsed by the Government Finance Officers Association, that I think is really the end all, and that's budgeting for equity. And what that does is make the scope of government completely open-ended, because any budget allocation that resolves any quote inequity in the jurisdiction of the municipality is justified. And so there aren't even pretend standards by which you can say this is something the organization shouldn't be involved in, because you can find and justify inequities everywhere throughout the city, and it can paralyze you in terms of making resource allocation choices. And so that's just really the ultimate in terms of scope. Your scope can't creep beyond budgeting for equity if that's what you take on. And so what all of these approaches miss is they throw out the nature of government in the way they conceptualize how government should engage. What is a local government? It's the legislative authority with enforcement powers, and those are good for certain things and not so good for other things. And when you engage the legislative authority in commercial activities, in charitable activities, and in trying to resolve equity issues, you've got a prescription for the kind of turmoil we have within our municipalities today. And so traditionally, or initially, government was a means to the ends of the residents' flourishing. It was there to protect the residents. It was to protect freedom of trade, freedom of association. And what's happened now is the institutions are becoming the bureaucracies that have their own ends, and then the residents and business owners become the means to that end. And I think a great example of this is if you ask a public official, if you ask a mayor of a city, how is the city doing? He or she will ask with the latest city revenue figures and new projects, new spending that the city is undergoing, rather than address how well is the city doing at protecting the rights and freedoms of the residents and business owners. So what I offer in the article and in general is this is not hopeless if we break the paradigm, if we reject the reinventing government approach, we reject the price of government approach, we reject the budgeting for equity approach, and think about what is the nature of government, what should the municipalities be doing. And the first step is re-examining the mission. And the mission should be focused on protecting rights and securing the conditions for flourishing, protecting voluntary association. And municipalities should take a hard look at what they've taken on in terms of the real estate they've taken on that they can't manage, the projects, the pet projects they've taken on that are really outside the scope of protecting the individual residents and business owners. And really every activity should go through a hardline questioning of, is this appropriate for a body wielding enforcement powers? And is this activity supporting or crowding out private investment, private capital, private individual innovation? And once that's done, you can get a pretty clear picture of what activities need to be retained, what activities should be terminated on the spot, and which activities may be a little more complex and ought to be phased out. But that's the only real healthy process that can get far enough underneath the trends that these organizations have adopted that can bring them back to an administrative base that they can actually manage the organization cleanly, and where the organization can be financed in a stable way and not with an ongoing kind of scarcity of funds, which is what we hear from most of our cities. So to just give a final thought, municipalities in the pattern that they've embraced, they at this point, they can't grow or shrink their way out of the crisis. That's just expanding or shrinking on scale, misguided goals, broad, vague goals that will keep it in turmoil. So if we don't boldly redefine the scope of local government, the resulting collapse, whether financial or service-based, that is the inability to provide services effectively and to maintain the infrastructure that the city's taken on, will only deepen the national crisis, and it will become a national issue. The reckoning has already arrived on Main Street, and so it's really time to stop looking at the presentation and the process and really start looking at the purpose and the substance. That concludes this week's episode. I'll see you next time. Thank you.